Welcome to our voyage through one of the most unsettling incidents in recorded history. Today we'll explore what happened in South Carolina during the beginning of the 20th century when the silence of the forests held mysteries that remain unsolved. Tell us where you are viewing this story in the comments. This film was made entirely for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any likeness to real people, alive or deceased, is entirely coincidental. 1902, South Carolina. The state was going through a time of transition, still mending the scars from earlier decades, as tiny rural villages looked for a place in a nation that was changing quickly. Life was predictable in Spartanburg County, which was bordered by hills covered in centuries-old oak and pine trees. Families congregated in churches on Sundays. Visitors were spotted right away, and farmers rose up before morning. It was in this environment of false calm that something unexpected started to happen. The initial hints appeared nearly, subtly, like shadows shifting in the corner of the eye. Strange events started to be reported by locals in a remote area close to the Paco River's banks. Personal items vanished for no apparent cause. In the morning, doors that had been locked would be discovered unlocked. The quiet of the muggy southern nights was broken by inexplicable noises that reverberated in the early morning. At first, no one was very interested. Every rural community has a story to tell. They're myths, transferred from one generation to the next. However, things changed when Margaret Holloway, a calm and sensible woman, arrived at the neighborhood police station with shaking hands and a pale face. She talked about discovering something unsettling and inappropriate on her property. Old records, hurriedly handwritten messages buried in a location no one had visited in years. Thomas Garrett, a middle-aged sheriff at the time, made the decision to look into the matter himself. He had known Margaret for ages and was aware that she wasn't the kind to make things up or become anxious easily. When he and two officers arrived at the Holley farm, he discovered precisely what she had told him. It appeared as though someone had intended to preserve the letters for a very long period because they were wrapped in waxed cloth and shielded from moisture. These documents contained unsettling information. They discussed covert meetings, transactions conducted in the dark, and the names of individuals who were no longer residents of the area or who had vanished into thin air. One of the letters had the date March 16, 1902, written in red ink. Margaret made the finding just a few days before that date. What did that signify? Was it a reminder, a warning, or something much darker? Even though Thomas Garrett was not easily scared, there was something about those remarks that really bothered him. He instructed his helpers to keep the discovery completely confidential while he conducted additional research. He had a private conversation with long-standing locals, those with strong recollections of the past. He then started to hear rumors about similar incidents that had allegedly happened decades earlier, all of which were mysterious and left him with no explanations. A pattern emerged. The first people to notice were those who lived in remote areas, far from cities. There have been reports of people wandering stealthily among the trees at dusk. Footprints discovered in unusual locations, as though someone had climbed steep rocks without any tools. The occurrences were always preceded by a thick quiet that seemed to drown out even the sound of birdsong. The Spartanburg Herald, the local newspaper, discreetly reported strange events in the area without providing specifics. There was division in the community. Others believed it was all a coincidence. Mass panic fueled by folklore. Others, on the other hand, started locking their homes more cautiously and avoiding lonely routes after. Sunset. Thomas Garrett was aware that he required additional details. He made the decision to look through the dusty archives that contained decades' worth of county records. He discovered something that made his blood shiver there, amidst faded print and yellowed sheets. There were unresolved cases of mysterious disappearances that consistently happened in areas close to the Pacole River, during particular periods of the year, and without exception. Although the parts were starting to fit together, the image they created was horrifying. There was no clear culprit, no apparent reason. It was as though something old had awakened, something that had existed long before the first colonists arrived. And now, in 1902, it was showing up once more. Every day, the tension increased. Margaret Holle was having trouble falling asleep. Where there shouldn't have been shadows, she saw them, heard noiseless footsteps. Other residents began to describe similar situations. Subtle, yet tangible, the fear permeated the plains like mist. Next, on the evening of March, on the eve of the date indicated in the letter 15th, 1902, something occurred that would permanently alter everything. The night of March 15th came with a heavy humidity that is typical of South Carolina spring. At key locations throughout the area referenced in the letters, Thomas Garrett had set up a covert surveillance operation. In order to cover a large area without attracting attention, he and his assistants took varied positions. The hours went by in excruciating slowness. The play. The river moved at a constant speed, unaffected by human stress. The quiet was periodically broken by small nocturnal creatures, but nothing noteworthy occurred. Thomas started to question whether all of this preparedness wasn't a fabrication, the result of fear-driven collective imagination. He became aware of something strange at that point, close to midnight. There was no particular movement or sound. It was not there. As though the forest itself had held its breath, there was complete silence. Even the river's steady murmur sounded to have decreased. Thomas felt a chill go down his back at that very instant. The crescent moon was the sole light that broke through the darkness. In between the trees, he could see a dim light moving. It wasn't the unpredictable sway of a lantern carried by a moving person. It was more consistent, more purposeful. As it approached a neighboring clearing, the light appeared to float, keeping its height and intensity constant. Thomas gave his soldiers a whispered signal and started to approach warily. Every action was. Years of practice kept him concentrated despite his heart thumping in his chest, which he calculated to make no noise. He could see people gathered in the area as he got closer. They were human beings. There was something unnerving about the way they stood still, almost like statues, even though he was certain of it. In all, he counted 7 individuals, all of whom were wearing dark clothing that blended in with the darkness. They remained silent. They remained still. They only formed an asymmetrical circle around an object that Thomas was unable to recognize. A distance. The ghostly aura created by the little lanterns positioned around the circle was the source of the light he had seen. On the opposite side of the clearing, one of Thomas's assistants stepped on a dry branch by mistake. In the silence of the night, the sound reverberated like a gunshot. All the figures immediately turned to face the sound. Thomas became bone-chillingly aware of something at that same instant. He was unable to distinguish faces. Despite the lantern's light, the characteristics of those individuals remained hidden, as though on purpose. Thomas hardly had time to comprehend what transpired next, since it happened so quickly. Moving with astonishing dexterity through the thick undergrowth, the people dispersed in several directions. They took their flashlights with them and vanished entirely into the darkness in a matter of seconds. It was almost completely black again in the clearing. At the location where the figures had been just moments earlier, Thomas and his men assembled. There, they discovered traces on the ground that suggested a heavy object had been dragged. Additionally, there were fragments of candles that were still burning and emitting an odd, sweet scent that none of them could identify. The most unsettling element, however, was a sign etched into the worn ground. It was a complicated geometric pattern, with crossing lines that was obviously deliberate yet had no apparent meaning. Garrett gave his troops instructions to meticulously record everything. They gathered the remnants of the candle, recorded the symbol in great detail, and measured the area's dimensions. A few hours later, as the sun rose, fresh information became visible. There were a lot of footprints, but they were arranged in a perplexing way that didn't show an obvious escape route. Thomas interviewed almost every local in the ensuing days. Nobody acknowledged being in the woodland that evening. The insignia was unrecognizable. The responses were evasive. Doors were shut with strained civility, and glances were avoided. The neighborhood, once cooperation, appeared reserved now. One of the few people who still spoke candidly with the sheriff was Margaret Holloway. She stated that her grandmother used to tell stories of secret rendezvous in the woods, but she had passed away many years ago. These ancient stories describe groups that gathered on particular occasions to carry out customs that originated from foreign traditions, combined with regional customs. However, they were merely tales. Margaret had always believed that, however. Thomas started looking through older records, some of which were so old that the ink was nearly unreadable. He came across references to closed societies or organizations that functioned behind the scenes in society. These groups fervently protected secrets, but they weren't necessarily criminal in the traditional sense. Their intentions were still unclear and covered in layers of conjecture and mystery. Thomas started to think about the symbol he had discovered in the clearing. In an attempt to understand its meaning, he drew it several times. He displayed it, too. Academics in nearby cities, but nobody provided adequate justifications. Others proposed links to ancient symbology. Others speculated that it might simply be a pointless illustration meant to perplex scholars. The odd occurrences persisted in the interim. On certain nights, residents reported hearing low chants, melodies in unrecognizable languages. Things continued to vanish and return in various places. People who lived in the most remote places began to feel as though they were being watched. Another, more thorough report on the ongoing investigations was published by the Spartanburg Herald. Though cautiously and without giving away all the specifics, the report made reference to the nighttime meeting in the woodland. Reactions to the publishing were not quite uniform. While some locals criticized the newspaper for causing needless fear, others called for increased safety. Thomas Garrett believed he was stuck in a maze with no way out. Every hint he followed appeared to raise more queries rather than responses. There was no way to identify the figures in the jungle. The meeting's goal was still unknown, and the letter's stated date of March 16th had come and gone without any obvious disastrous incident. However, something had changed. Thomas sensed it. It seemed as though something was slowly polluting the area's everyday reality through an invisible door that had been opened that night in the clearing. In the weeks that followed, there was a barely noticeable shift in the communities. Actions. Thomas Garrett saw how people avoided particular routes, how discussions stopped abruptly when he got close, and how tense looks were silently exchanged. The locals' trust in the sheriff started to evaporate like mist in the sun. A traveler reached the area in April of 1902. He was a middle-aged man named Jonathan Webb, who claimed to be recording Southern customs and anecdotes for a book. While staying at the modest neighborhood inn, he started questioning. Inquiries concerning myths from antiquity, inexplicable occurrences, and the secrets of ancient families. On the main street, Thomas happened to meet Webb. The man constantly carried a battered leather notepad, wore thin-rimmed glasses, and had an air of intellectual air. After a brief conversation, Thomas understood that Webb was more familiar with the area than a recent arrival should be. He gave specifics about the topography of the area, families who had lived there for many generations, and occasions that were. Seldom freely discussed. Thomas was intrigued and asked Webb to stay on the line. Webb, seated in the office of the police station, disclosed that he had been researching the patterns of mysterious occurrences throughout the east coast of the United States for years. According to his theory, some areas had recurrent history cycles of events that repeated themselves over decades or even centuries, with slight modifications. He claimed that this kind of phenomena was very prevalent in South Carolina. Webb displayed his own documents, pages upon pages of thorough notes on enigmatic symbols discovered in several states, nighttime encounters, and disappearances. Even if it was slight, there was a pattern. The incidents always happened close to bodies of water, in relatively remote towns, with people operating in complete secret, and finally, the events just stopped, leaving only unsolved questions. Thomas told Webb what he had found: the reports of weird activity, the letters buried on the Hole property, and the symbol in the clearing. Webb looked at, making more notes, paying close attention to everything, and making connections Thomas hadn't thought of. He proposed that it could be a combination of even earlier local customs and customs introduced by immigrants from various parts of Europe. They made the decision to look into the local church's records together. Beyond formal records, churches frequently retained notes about local residents, social gatherings, and even covertly documented rumors. The reverend at the moment isn't old. Samuel Pierce, a guy, was first hesitant to grant access to the ancient files, but Thomas's polite persistence finally persuaded him. Interesting information was found in the files. There were references to internal disputes that occurred decades ago within the congregation, disagreements over improper activities, and members who had been quietly expelled. A single name kept coming up in notes from various eras: the Twilight Society. Only vague explanations of what this society was and did were provided. Allusions to conferences and worries about outside influences on accepted dogma. This particular element piqued Webb's interest. He stated that he had discovered such references in other areas, all of which had the same structure but somewhat different names. Groups on the periphery of formal society, such as the Evening Brotherhood in Georgia and the Midnight Society in Virginia, were never quite open nor entirely secret. The properties listed in the old papers were first mapped by Thomas and Webb. They found that a large number of people surrounded the location of the midnight gathering in an asymmetrical circle. Was that just a coincidence? Or was there deliberate preparation? Decisions taken over many generations to maintain some families' proximity to a particular area. Margaret Hole went looking for Thomas once again throughout this probe. Compared to previous weeks, she appeared more composed. However, her speech had a sense of urgency. She had discovered another item on her land, this time concealed in her home's attic within a box that had been her grandmother's. They were faded vintage photos of formal stances with groups of people. One of them has the date 1878 on the back, although the persons in the pictures were dressed in period-appropriate attire. One particular element caught our attention. Each of them had a little thing in their hands. These seemed like medals or some sort of talismans, but the visual quality made them hard to identify. Additionally, in the backdrop of one of the pictures, if little out of focus, was the same symbol that Thomas had discovered in the clearing. Using a magnifying glass, Webb studied the photos, taking note of every feature. He proposed that those items might serve as indicators of membership in a certain group. These customs were prevalent in closed societies as a means of fostering unity and allegiance among members. What these societies were for was still an open topic. Through their covert meetings, what did they want to achieve? As spring advanced, the days became longer. Thomas stayed up at night, examining materials and attempting to make connections between disparate pieces of information. Webb stayed around, getting more and more involved in the inquiry. They had formed an odd alliance, with the sheriff's practicality enhancing the researchers' scholarly methodology. One of those evenings was when Thomas came to a startling insight. What would happen if this group's actions weren't novel? What if they were a continuance rather than a revival? Something that had never really stopped, only got more covert, more cautious, maintaining its core while adjusting to the times. This potential created terrible possibilities. It would imply that persons he spoke to on a regular basis and knew could be involved. That there was an entirely different layer of reality behind the surface of everyday normalcy. Despite his official position, he had no access to this reality. Margaret reported her grandmother had said something odd just before she died. She mentioned several families' secrets, held as essential burdens of forefathers' promises that future generations had to uphold. Margaret had taken this at the moment as the ramblings of an old mind. She was no longer so certain. South Carolina experienced heavy rainfall in May. The Play River increased significantly, overflowing in certain parts and creating mud in arid areas. Something unexpected occurred during one of these storms. After days of floods, a structure became visible as the water receded. That was still concealed under the riverbank. The first person to notice was a local fisherman who was attempting to get back to his operations following the storm. These stones were positioned in a way that was obviously deliberate, creating what looked to be the base of an old building. He alerted Thomas Garrett right away, and Webb and Garrett arrived on the scene. It was a tiny building, maybe a few square meters. Despite decades of dirt covering the stones, their arrangement suggested intentional and meticulous labor. Webb conjectured that it could be the ruins of a building that is far older than any known structure in the area. At that particular location on the river, there were no formal records of any construction. They planned a meticulous excavation. They started removing layers of muck and aquatic vegetation with the assistance of a few cooperative locals. With the water still high and the potential for further rain, the work was laborious and slow, but every day added more information about the enigmatic structure. On the third day of excavation, they discovered something that fundamentally altered the course of the study. It was a heavy, compact, and tightly sealed metal box. The edges had been attacked by rust, but the contents were still safe. They succeeded in opening it with great caution. Documents wrapped in oil linen that had been immersed for decades were unexpectedly intact. The records were written in English, but they were difficult to understand due to their antiquated style. They were dated from 1847, which was over 50 years ago. They were minutes of meetings and decisions taken by a group claiming to be the Threshold's guardians. Although the name was mysterious, the contents implied that this organization thought it had a particular duty associated with that location. The stone edifice was not your typical building, according to the records. It was referred to as a marker, something used to indicate a location of particular importance. The manuscripts discussed customs that had been passed down orally through the ages, information that, purportedly, existed before the area was colonized by Europeans. The group considered itself to be the keepers of these customs, in charge of upholding specific rights that would guarantee equilibrium. Webb was enthralled. Although he had researched comparable communities in other regions of the nation, he had never come across such clear records of their activities and beliefs. However, Thomas was becoming more and more uncomfortable. It implied that what he had seen in the clearing in March was a part of something much bigger rather than an isolated incident, and more mature. The documents specified the dates on which meetings were to be held throughout the year. When Thomas compared the old and modern calendars, he discovered that while March was one of those dates, there were others. The notes indicated that the next one would take place at the start of August. About 3 months remained. The community was swiftly informed about the structure's discovery in the river. There were a variety of responses. While some were genuinely curious, others were subtly irritated by the meddling in what they regarded as regionally private affairs. Even subtle attempts were made to deter future research, arguing that the history should be kept hidden and that unearthing the past will only cause issues. Thomas was put in a difficult situation. It was his duty as a law enforcement officer to look into anything that might indicate criminal conduct. However, there was also no conclusive proof that any crimes were being committed. Meetings held in secret were not prohibited in themselves. The building in the river, the ancient documents, and the symbol painted on the ground. That was all odd, but not necessarily illegal. Webb proposed an alternative strategy. Perhaps they should attempt to comprehend the phenomenon from a historical and anthropological perspective, approaching those involved as participants in a cultural tradition rather than as suspects, rather than conducting an investigation as if it were a police case. Although Thomas had doubts about this tactic, he acknowledged that his straightforward approach was not generating outcomes. They made the decision to look for the descendants of the families listed in the records from 1847. While many of these families had relocated to more urban regions, some resided in the neighborhood. The Whitmore family, who owned a sizable farm a few kilometers from the river, was one of them. In the community, Edward Whitmore, the current patriarch, was seen as a quiet but esteemed individual. It was a tense visit to the Whitors. Edward, obviously uneasy in their company, greeted them with icy civility. Edward's face went completely white when Thomas brought up the documents discovered in the river. After asking to see the papers and taking a quick look at them, he said nothing for a few minutes. Edward finally said something. He acknowledged that his family was aware of the customs listed in the documents, saying that while some members had attended meetings and upheld particular behaviors over the years, it was all innocuous and merely a means of respecting ancestors and fostering a sense of community. Connections, nothing ominous or perilous. Thomas insisted on further information. Edward declined to go into further detail, merely stating that not everything needed to be understood by outsiders, and that some things were better left unexplained. His words carried a tone of caution, not quite a threat, but a clear indication that carrying out more research might have unfavorable effects. Webb and Thomas talked about the encounter after they left the Whitmore farm. Edward clearly knew far more than he had disclosed. It made it apparent that he had no intention of voluntarily cooperating. They had to deal with allegiances that went beyond generations, pledges made so long ago that they had become an integral part of the identity of these families. Summer was taking over from spring. The heat in South Carolina was getting unbearable. It also brought with it an increasing sense of impending danger. Trying to grasp something before it was too late made Thomas feel as though he was in a race against time. Too late for what, though? There was still no answer to that question. June of 1902 arrived, bringing with it a humid heat that felt like a blanket of oppression over the area. As Thomas Garrett carried out his investigation, he became more and more aware that he was being watched not overtly, but through fleeting glances and conversations that stopped when he went by. Everywhere he went, there was a silent surveillance. Jonathan Webb had settled down almost permanently. His early investigation had become an obsession. He stayed at the county library for whole days, looking through old maps, property records, anything that might provide insight into the threshold keepers. His research revealed an intriguing and unsettling picture. Webb discovered proof that the group had a significant impact on the area's growth, including planned marriages between particular families, strategic land acquisitions, and even covert meddling in local elections. All of this was done quietly, never drawing too much attention, but progressively reshaping the neighborhood in accordance with an unidentified goal. One afternoon, as you were going over, Webb drew lines connecting the properties of the family listed in the documents on old maps found in the police station office. There was no denying the pattern that developed. The properties surrounded the building on the river in an almost perfect circle. This circle's center was exactly where Thomas had seen the meeting at night in March. Thomas proposed that they make a note of every important thing they have found thus far. The area where the nocturnal rendezvous took place, and the Holloway property where the letters were discovered. Occurred the old family's farms and the building on the river. Another pattern appeared when they plotted everything on a single map. Spread over a kilom of land, the points formed what seemed to be the identical sign observed in the clearing, but on a much bigger scale. They were both stunned by the realization. If deliberate, it was the result of decades or even centuries of planning. A nearly unthinkable enterprise carried out by consecutive generations without the majority of. People in the area were completely unaware of what was going on beneath their feet. Margaret Holley went looking for Thomas once more, but this time she was there for a different reason. She had made the decision to tell him something that her grandmother had told her years ago, but she had vowed never to tell anyone. However, Margaret believed that silence was no longer viable in light of everything that was being found. Her grandma claimed that elder members of local families held a certain belief. They thought that the area in which they resided was unique, with a particularly thin line separating the ordinary world from something else. Their rituals were designed to maintain this boundary's stability and stop anything undesired from moving across it. The tale sounded like rural superstition, fostered by years of seclusion or folklore. Margaret, however, maintained that her grandmother was realistic and not prone to illusions. Like other members of the group, she sincerely believed what she said. Elderly families. For them, everything came down to inherited responsibility rather than faith or imagination. What would happen if the ceremony stopped? Thomas wondered. Margaret paused before responding. Her grandma had described times in the past when the group's internal conflicts or outside meddling caused the activities to be disrupted. Strange incidents allegedly increased throughout these times, as did inexplicable disappearances, illogical phenomena, and an overall feeling of chaos that penetrated the area. Webb was acquainted with such stories from various civilizations. Many human communities have come to believe that certain places serve as thresholds, gates, or intersections between many realms. Typically, these impressions were generated by peculiar natural features and geographical factors. In the instance of South Carolina, the structure's unusual rock formation beneath it, its closeness to the river, and the amount of flora could have contributed to the formation of these ideas. However, Webb cautioned that when people acted on their ideas, they had actual power, independent of their factual foundation. Interfering with the threshold keeper's rituals could cause unpredictable reactions if they thought they were protecting the area through them. This is not because the rituals were effective in and of themselves, but rather because upsetting the social structure that supported them could have real repercussions. Thomas had a problem. In his capacity as a police officer, he was intended to guarantee the legality and transparency of operations under his jurisdiction. However, there was no concrete proof that anything unlawful was taking place, and making people reveal private activities may make matters worse rather than better. He was thinking about this when he got a surprise visit. He didn't instantly recognize the elder man. The guest introduced himself as Robert Ashford, who had departed the area many years prior, but kept ties to family. He chose to come back to provide perspective after learning about the investigations through letters from family members. Robert was direct. In his younger years, he had been a part of the threshold keepers, but he decided he could no longer be involved because the duty was too much for him to handle, not because he didn't agree with the group's goals. He saw the gatherings as serious occasions that carried deeper significance than simple social etiquette. Robert claims that the keepers were neither dangerous nor malevolent. They were common folks who felt they had inherited a significant responsibility. In order to recognize and honor something they thought existed there, the ceremonies mostly used symbols, words that had been passed down through the generations, and customs. He said that he had never seen anything that might be either dangerous or illegal. Thomas asked about the March meeting he had observed. Robert was not shocked that anything had happened. It was among the group's calendar's significant dates. Not because they were doing improperly, but rather because exposure could undermine the trust required to continue the actions. The quick dispersal upon discovery was a preventative precaution. Being secret meant acknowledging that not everyone would understand, not that one was guilty. Thomas was even more torn after speaking with Robert. A part of him preferred to accept the straightforward explanation and put the case aside as a historical oddity with little bearing on the law, while another portion possibly. After spending weeks immersed in the enigma, it became apparent that there were more profound levels that had not yet been uncovered. With the arrival of July came frequent storms. The uncovered stone building was once again covered by the rising Pacolet River. It seemed as though nature itself worked to conceal secrets and thwarted human attempts to reveal them all. August was drawing near, and with it came the tangible tension that Thomas Garrett had come to identify. Ancient records state that the start of August signaled new, crucial date for those who maintain the threshold. This conference could be even more important than the one in March, Webb conjectured, based on notes that indicated hierarchies and cycles in the ceremonial calendar of the community. Even Thomas was taken aback by the choice he made. He chose to be straightforward rather than plan another covert monitoring operation. He went back to Edward Whitmore and asked for an open discussion. At first, Edward objected, but something about Thomas's demeanor, possibly the obvious fatigue. He changed his mind because of the honesty in his voice or the expression on his face. At last, Edward started talking while sitting on the Whitmore farm's porch, the late afternoon sun gilding everything. The keepers, he clarified, were not an organization in the contemporary sense. There were no official documents, registered members, or formal organization. It resembled a network of families with shared obligations and information that had been passed down through the years. Edward claimed that the customs they upheld were methods of recognizing the history of the community in which they resided. Their forefathers had discovered that area long before the majority of the settlers did, and they had grown to deeply appreciate its distinctive features over the years. The customs served as manifestations of this reverence and a means of preserving ties to the land and the past. Thomas asked about the odd happenings that locals had been reporting for several months. Edward let out a long breath and responded. He acknowledged that occasionally, when the routines were interrupted or unusual things tended to happen when the group received too much outside attention. This was not because the rituals had supernatural power, but rather because the disturbance changed delicate patterns of behavior that had been built over decades in the society. Thomas's curiosity was somewhat satiated by the explanation, but many questions remained. Seeing the hesitancy, Edward made a surprise proposition. If Thomas consented to do so, he would permit him to see the August meeting. So, as a courteous visitor rather than an investigator. Under the same circumstances, Webb would also be welcome. It was a dangerous proposal. Although accepting the conditions established by the people he was looking into would technically compromise Thomas's official position, it also offered a rare chance to finally comprehend what was going on. Thomas agreed after speaking with Webb, who was excited about the prospect. The days before the encounter were peculiar. Thomas was conflicted about his duty as sheriff and his increasing interest. Margaret Holloway was the only person he had told about the deal, and she responded with a mix of relief and trepidation, Although she was relieved that a peaceful conclusion could be possible, she was concerned about what Thomas might learn. Edward Whitmore showed up at the police station around dusk on August 4th. He told Webb and Thomas to follow him, but not to ask any questions. They strolled down paths that Thomas was unfamiliar with, even though he thought he was familiar with the area. In the faint light of nightfall, the forest appeared quieter and denser. The clearing they reached was not the same as the one Thomas had seen in March. This one was bigger, with old trees creating a canopy that seemed almost organic. Maybe 15 or 20 people were already there, quite plainly dressed, but all of them had little medallions dangling from chains. The medallions matched exactly what Thomas had seen in the ancient photos Margaret had discovered. The presence of Thomas and Webb did not appear to surprise anyone. Silent acknowledgments and subtle nods were exchanged. Edward placed them at the edge of the clearing so they could watch without getting in the way. Then the meeting started as the night became darker. What happened was neither dramatic nor alarming. After forming a circle, each person gave a brief speech. They thanked the land they lived on, named forebears by name, and reiterated their commitment to conserving local heritage. It was sad and heartfelt, more akin to a memorial service than anything Thomas could serve as a comparison. Following the individual presentations, the entire group chanted words in a language that Thomas was unfamiliar with. Webb muttered that it appeared to be a blend of unidentifiable ingredients and old European languages. The recitation lacked the passion typically associated with religious rites, yet it was melodic and almost chant-like. There was stillness following the recitation. Everyone was still, as though they were all meditating. The breeze in the leaves above was the only sound, with the sound of the river in the distance. Although it seemed longer to Thomas, the silence lasted for around 20 minutes. Edward eventually made his way to the middle of the circle. In the light of the few lanterns set up around him, he grasped something little that glowed dimly. It was a dark, smooth stone with veins that seemed to absorb light in a peculiar way. He took a step back after carefully placing it on the ground in the clearing's precise middle. The participants came one by one to the stone, gave it a little touch with their right hand, and then went back to their positions. Edward took the stone and wrapped it in fabric once everyone had completed this. The meeting ended just as abruptly as it had started. With the familiarity of those who knew every way by heart, the people started to scatter in various directions and vanish into the forest. Edward went up to Webb and Thomas. He questioned whether they had seen enough to comprehend. To be honest, Thomas had no idea how to respond. What he had seen was peculiar, because nothing was visibly wrong. But it was unfamiliar. It was just a collection of folks upholding their own customs. However, he was troubled by something. Thomas had experienced an odd feeling during the ceremony, as though the clearing's air were heavier and more charged. It was more of a knowledge that he was in an important place than a feeling of uneasiness. Later, Webb agreed that he felt the same way, though both acknowledged that it might just be psychological, the result of atmosphere and anticipation. Over the next few days, Thomas thought deeply about what he had seen. Despite their peculiarity, he concluded that the threshold keepers were not dangerous. They were individuals attempting to stay connected to their history in ways that made sense to them. This perseverance was almost praiseworthy in a world that was changing so quickly. Webb concurred, but made a crucial addition. Throughout human history, many seemingly innocuous activities have been abandoned. Vigilance meant awareness, not suspicion. He proposed that Thomas could be better suited as a witness, someone who was aware of what was going on and could make sure it stayed within reasonable bounds rather than an investigator. The mood in the area changed somewhat, but noticeably in September. It seemed as though the tension that had ruled the preceding months was finally starting to ease. Thomas Garrett observed that talks no longer ended abruptly, and that people greeted him more casually when he came over. The community appeared to be breathing easier. Though his priorities had changed, Jonathan Webb was still in South Carolina. He started recording the group as a historical and cultural curiosity, rather than looking into it as a suspicious phenomena. In order to preserve oral histories that could otherwise be lost to time, he conducted extensive interviews with elderly members of the families concerned. Building confidence gradually via sincere respect was a delicate task. Margaret Holloway appeared more composed then. It had been months since Thomas had seen her. She said that the revelation of the secrets, even if only partially, had relieved a burden she was unaware she was carrying. Her family had kept awkward silences for generations, divided between a wish to live more freely and a commitment to tradition. Maybe a balance may be found today. However, not all issues had been fully settled. Strange phenomena were still being reported to Thomas on occasion. Not quite as severe as during the initial months of the year, but persistent items that moved around without any apparent reason. Nighttime noises that could not be traced back to a certain source. Feelings of presence in areas that ought to have been deserted. Webb came up with the hypothesis that these phenomena might have more to do with psychological and social factors than the paranormal. A shared reality can be created by a community's unified belief that something is happening. People make sense of unclear situations through the prism of that conviction, perpetuating it. It was a complicated social construct rather than fraud or personal fancy. Along with other senior keepers, Edward Whitmore requested Thomas to join him for another discussion. They wanted to have a clear idea of what to do next. They expected their privacy to be respected within normal bounds, but they also acknowledged that they could no longer function in total secrecy in light of everything that had been revealed. Thomas made a proposal. He would be kept up to speed on the group's activities, including the dates and general location of meetings, but he wouldn't get involved unless there was a blatant sign of danger or unlawful behavior. In exchange, the keepers would pledge to build a mutually trusting relationship with local authorities by being more open about their procedures. Following discussion among the members of the group, the plan was approved. Neither party thought the agreement was perfect, yet both acknowledged as essential. For the keepers, it was a major shift, requiring them to adjust centuries-old customs to the demands of a more interconnected and secret-tolerant society. Webb ultimately got ready to depart the area in October 1902. He had collected enough information for a number of scholarly articles, possibly even a book in the future. However, the knowledge he had gained was more significant than the scholarly papers. Strange things weren't always dangerous. Not all mysteries had to be fully disassembled. It was sometimes better to respect complexity rather than impose oversimplified explanations. Webb and Thomas had a final talk on the police station porch the night before he left. They thought back on the remarkable months they had experienced. Thomas acknowledged that he had started the inquiry in the hopes of discovering a blatant threat or criminal plot. Rather, he observed people attempting to make meaning of their lives by engaging in activities that linked the past and present. Webb noted that, in one form or another, this was essentially what all human communities did. This was not unique to the keepers. Their expressions were only more formal and emphatic. Often, it was only familiarity and the quantity of participants that distinguished acceptable tradition from odd practice. However, they both concurred that that specific area of South Carolina was unique. Maybe it was only the combination of geographical and historical elements that had produced a setting that is conducive to the growth of these activities. Or maybe there was more, something that was difficult to explain. They both decided that it might not be vital to know, and that they would probably never know for sure. Thomas resumed his regular duties as sheriff following Webb's departure, but the experience had altered him. He had discovered that leadership occasionally entailed understanding when to refrain from interfering, and that authority did not always equate to complete control. The community he oversaw was more intricate than he could have ever dreamed, with layers of significance and history that extended well beyond what was immediately apparent. The last several months of 1902 went by without any significant events. The everlasting cycle of the seasons persisted. South Carolina life had its own cadence. With the local authorities' covert but official knowledge, the threshold keepers continued their operations. Although it wasn't ideal, the arrangement worked. On occasion, Margaret Holey came to Thomas for private discussions. She had made the decision to delve further into records and stories she had previously shied away from in order to discover more about her own family history. Out of discomfort, she learned that her forebears had been interesting, multifaceted individuals who used the resources at their disposal to deal with the difficulties of their era. Despite all of its quirks, she came to take pleasure in her background. When winter arrived, the area saw unusually low temperatures. For the first time in decades, the Pacolet River partially froze, constructing oddly beautiful sceneries. On occasion, Thomas would stroll to the banks and look at the stone building that he now knew was below the water. Knowing that it was there, a silent reminder of everything that had been found and everything that was yet unknown, was somewhat reassuring. He frequently pondered a statement made by Edward Whitmore during one of their discussions, which suggested that the keeper's actions might really serve more as a reminder than as a means of controlling or keeping anything potent. To keep in mind that there was depth and history beneath every stride taken on that earth, the world was larger and more intricate than everyday routine suggested. In his work, which frequently dealt with the most sinister facets of human nature, Thomas learned to value this viewpoint. Knowing that people also organized themselves around goals that went beyond short-term self-interest was reassuring. The Guardians upheld customs out of a sense of obligation to something bigger than themselves rather than for their own benefit. Themselves. There was a false silence at the start of 1903. The new equilibrium between the government and the threshold guardians had become second nature to Thomas Garrett. On the appointed days, the meetings proceeded as planned, always discreet and mindful of the agreements reached. The community appeared to have come to terms with the situation, realizing that certain things could be kept private without posing a threat. Something unexpected happened in February of that year. A stranger showed up in the area, distinct from Jonathan Webb in nearly every way. Thomas was immediately suspicious of this individual, who identified himself as Daniel Crane, because of his hurry and resolve. Despite claiming to be a researcher, Crane's queries were less scholarly and more combative than Webb's. Crane started probing the keepers with specific questions, displaying in-depth knowledge that he shouldn't have. He included names, dates, and particular customs that were allegedly kept under wraps. Thomas looked for information on. Crane was evasive, shifting the topic whenever questioned about where this information originated. Edward Whitmore came over to Thomas, clearly worried. Crane had shown up on his property and made vague requests, which had caused him discomfort. Crane implied that if the keepers didn't comply with his demands, he possessed material that could expose them negatively. It had the taste of coercion, but it wasn't really blackmail in the legal sense. Thomas looked into Crane's history and found an unsettling trend. The man had made appearances in different parts of the South, always showing interest in organizations like the Keepers, and always departing with something of value for himself. Sometimes it was cash, and other times it was antiques from the past that he sold to collectors. In essence, he exploited the customs of others. Thomas found himself in a difficult predicament. Technically speaking, Crane wasn't breaking any laws. However, he was obviously creating a disruption and possibly endangering the shaky calm that has been achieved. Thomas made the decision to face him head-on, letting him know that he was being watched and that any suspicious behavior would be dealt with to the fullest extent possible by the law. With a chilly smile, Crane replied, implying that Thomas was oddly protective of a group he had looked into as a suspect months before. That observation contained an unsettling truth. Thomas was no longer the same. As he gained knowledge and experience, his viewpoint changed. He is now considered the keepers to be an important component of the community's cultural fabric rather than a threat. The impact of Crane's presence was surprising. It brought the town together in a way Thomas had never witnessed. The keepers were now defended by those who had before been wary of them. People who had never engaged in the activities acknowledged their right to exist free from malevolent outside intervention. Internal solidarity was fostered by the external threat. Margaret Holloway was especially outspoken. She planned community events where they talked about how to keep explorers like Crane away from their history and customs. It was about protecting cultural sovereignty from those who sought to market or misrepresent important customs, not about hiding secrets out of embarrassment. Crane spent a few weeks in the area, but everywhere he went, he encountered locked doors. Nobody complied with his inquiries. His offers went unanswered. He eventually departed, disappointed and with no other choice. However, his visit made a lasting impression by serving as a reminder that the world wouldn't always be courteous or compassionate. The keepers convened a special meeting following Crane's departure. Thomas was invited to take part as an honorary member of the community rather than as an outsider. It was an acknowledgement of the role he had performed as a true defender of local interests, as well as an authority. Edward Whitmore discussed changes the group needed to think about during this meeting. The world was changing quickly. The number of foreign visitors to the area was increasing. Drawn to fresh chances and economic growth, in order to preserve traditions in the future, it will be necessary to develop ways to keep their essence while making adjustments for contemporary circumstances. The conversation was drawn out and occasionally tearful. Because they believed it was a betrayal of their forefathers, older members opposed any change. Younger members contended that survival required adaptability. As the society struggled with conflicts between continuity and change, Thomas observed with fascination. A crucial choice came out of the encounter. The keepers would start formally recording their customs in writing so that they might be passed down to future generations for internal preservation rather than external publication. It was an understanding that despite its strength, oral memory was brittle and susceptible to disruptions and temporal distortions. Thomas provided helpful advice. In his capacity as an official, he could guarantee that records would be preserved in the county archives and made available to descendants, but shielded from explorers or curious bystanders. Both the need for privacy and the need for preservation were met by this arrangement. The documentation work started in the ensuing months. Knowledge that the keepers had kept for decades was shared by longtime members. These were intriguing stories that combined historical facts with generation-to-generation interpretations. After hearing about the project, Webb wrote a letter providing advice on historical preservation best practices. Margaret was essential to this process. She was the perfect person to record the stories in an orderly and clear way because of her literacy and attention to detail. She found that she had a gift for crafting inquiries that evoked meanings and contexts in addition to facts, giving the stories life. Renewal came both literally and figuratively in the spring of 1903. The pastures surrounding the Paco River were blanketed in vividly colored carpets of wild flowers. The encounter seemed to have rejuvenated and energized the town. Of nearly losing its customs, and then organizing to defend them. There was a fresh understanding of the region's distinctive qualities and a renewed sense of purpose. After that March night the year before, Thomas thought about how much he had changed. He had started by looking for straightforward answers to enigmatic occurrences. Instead, he discovered the depth of human complexity. He discovered that sometimes comprehension was more important than explanation, and that not all mysteries needed to be solved. The building and the river, still underwater, but always. Existing in the common consciousness, came to represent this comprehension. It served as a tangible symbol of unseen depths and a constant reminder that there is always more than meets the eye. Thomas might have believed it to be the real lesson of the entire ordeal. The extreme heat of the summer of 1903 caused the air in South Carolina's fields to quake. Thomas Garrett had become accustomed to his routine, juggling his official duties with the unusual role he had taken on as a bridge between the outer world and the keepers. He had never envisioned himself in that role, but it suddenly felt almost inevitable. Margaret Holley kept up her documentation efforts, but this process had produced something new. She started to see trends in the stories that went beyond the keepers' own tales. There were ties to other communities in nearby states and networks of related customs that pointed to a more extensive and ancient migration than anyone had anticipated. Particularly, old communications between members from various places led to an exciting finding. Carefully stored in family trunks, these letters demonstrated that the keepers were not a unique occurrence. Comparable groups, dispersed from Virginia to Georgia, maintained comparable customs while adapting to the unique features of their own communities, and they communicated on a frequent basis. This discovery captivated Thomas. Thus, what he had found in South Carolina was merely a piece of something far bigger. When Webb learned of this through correspondence, he said he wanted to go back and look into these links more thoroughly. But he also cautioned that some things could be better left alone and that too much exposure could be detrimental. Margaret's findings were validated by Edward Whitmore. He clarified that despite the fact that each group functioned separately, there was a common understanding of being a part of something greater. Occasionally, representatives from various regions convened to share information and renew promises rather than to plan activities. This discovery prompted inquiries regarding the number of other southern towns that upheld comparable customs without the knowledge of local authorities. Thomas pondered whether sheriffs in other counties had encountered similar situations, uncovering hidden facets in the neighborhoods they were tasked with defending. The first open visits by representatives of other organizations to the area occurred in September 1903. They were elderly men and women who exuded a gentle authority derived from decades of upholding customs. Locals were initially uneasy about their presence, but Edward made an effort to make the visit both necessary and cordial. At a meticulously planned meeting, Thomas was introduced to these guests. As a possible model for their own areas, they conveyed their admiration for the system that had been developed in South Carolina. The notion of open cooperation with local government was relatively new and remained contentious among the various factions, notwithstanding its limitations. The discussion showed that every area has particular difficulties. While some villages struggled with the burden of growing industrialization, others saw an influx of newcomers who were unfamiliar with and disrespectful of traditional customs. But all have the same basic worry about how to maintain meaningful practices in a world that is changing more and more quickly. Margaret took part in these conversations, offering the viewpoint of someone who had lived in two different worlds, understanding the customs, but also challenging them. Her voice provided crucial balance, reminding us that traditions might change without losing their essential qualities, and that preservation did not imply stagnation. These conversations resulted in an important conclusion. The various organizations decided to create a network of unofficial contacts so they could exchange problems and solutions. It would not be an official company with a hierarchy, but rather an understanding that they had comparable problems and could share knowledge. Thomas was both impressed and nervous as he saw all of this. On the one hand, it was lovely to witness individuals from various places coming together for a similar goal. However, he was concerned about what would happen if this network got too big or drew unwelcome notice from higher governmental authorities. After a while, the guests left with favorable opinions about South Carolina, as well as the special arrangement that had been made there. Edward thanked Thomas for his part in not only putting up with the keeper's actions, but also actively trying to keep them under control. The woodlands surrounding the Pacolet River were a riot of color in October. On occasion, Thomas strolled by himself along these paths, thinking back on the remarkable year he had experienced. He reflected on how his views had evolved and how he had come to appreciate complexity, where previously all he had witnessed was strangeness. Margaret once said that Thomas had essentially taken on the role of guardian of guardians. He smiled at the statement, but he also realized how true it was. Because he believed it had worth and should exist, he had taken on the unofficial duty of defending something he didn't entirely comprehend. Thomas knew exactly where the building in the river was, even if it was still underwater. Every now and then, when the water level fell, tiny sections became visible, tangible reminders of all he had learned. He began to see it as a sign of depth and continuity rather than a riddle that needed to be answered. Webb and Margaret started exchanging letters on a regular basis. They talked about the keeper's historical background as well as more general philosophical issues of custom, change, and what it meant to be a member of the society. In order to preserve the anonymity of those involved, Webb had consented to withhold certain details from a scholarly paper he was working on. November came with early, chilly conditions. Thomas observed the community's literal and symbolic winter preparations. A new, distinct, but long-lasting stability seemed to have replaced the turbulent events of 1902, as if a cycle had been finished. In light of Thomas's contribution, Edward Whitmore casually said that the keepers intended to host a special ceremony of thanks. Margaret persuaded him to agree, stating that it was crucial for the community to show gratitude. The ceremony was modest but heartfelt. In the same area where Thomas had originally seen it, a little medallion resembling those worn by members was presented along with words of gratitude. It was a symbolic act that acknowledged him as an ally and defender rather than formally admitting him as a member. Knowing that the medallion symbolized more than merely sculpted metal, Thomas treasured it. It represented bridges across worlds and trust gained from tolerance and deference. That may have easily stayed apart. The South Carolina region saw slow but unavoidable changes in the ensuing years. As he grew older, Thomas Garrett maintained his position as sheriff, handling the extraordinary events of 1902 with the same decorum. The town prospered by striking a balance between modernization and reverence for its distinctive customs. Margaret Holloway finished her paperwork, compiling a thorough account of the keeper's customs and narratives. The records were meticulously preserved, safeguarded for upcoming generations, who will have to make their own decisions on how to respect the past while constructing the future. That effort had given her a surprising sense of purpose, turning her initial curiosity into her life's purpose. On the scheduled dates, the threshold guards had their meetings as before, but with a new understanding. They now understood that they were a part of a larger network of related customs, and that they were not entirely alone. Strength came from this relationship, but there was also a duty to protect something. That went beyond personal preference. A younger generation took over the group's leadership after Edward Whitmore. He spent his last years content, knowing that he had successfully navigated a challenging time without compromising the core of what the keepers stood for. He was confident that the customs would be upheld even with the required modifications. The seamless transfer was evidence of the technique's ability to withstand decades of change. In the end, Jonathan Webb published his work, albeit in a manner that honored the participants' right to privacy. Without mentioning particular places or actual individuals, his book explored patterns of covert customs in the American South. It developed into a reputable, scholarly resource that advanced our knowledge of how many societies preserved their unique cultural identities. Every now and again, Thomas got letters from sheriffs or officers in other areas who had found comparable circumstances in their districts. He usually answered with fundamental guidance he had picked up from. Experience. Be respectful before you show suspicion. Before passing judgment, try to understand. Understand that danger was not always indicated by mystery. The human tragedies taking place on its banks did not affect the Play River's unending flow. When the circumstances were correct, the stone structure would occasionally come to the surface, but it would always return to its aquatic solitude. It served as a tangible anchor for tales that cut over generations and remained consistent in a world that was changing. The mysteries were hidden in the nearby forests, silent observers of. Rites carried out in the moonlight, intimate chats and nighttime meetings. Trees that were centuries old have witnessed it all before and will do so once more. Passive participants in the never-ending circle of human change and continuation. Sometimes, as they grew older, Margaret and Thomas would stroll along the paths while thinking back on their incredible adventure together. They would discuss how comprehension had replaced their initial dread, how protection had evolved from investigation. It was a tale of both personal development and collective mystery. Eventually, the events of 1902 were ingrained in the local consciousness, a story that was recounted differently depending on the speaker. It was a tale of authority learning humility for some. Others saw it as a matter of the community protecting customs against outside influence. There were truths in every version. None adequately conveyed the intricacy of what had transpired. Thomas kept the little medallion he had been given in one of his desk drawers. He clutched it periodically, but rarely showed it to anyone. He reminded himself that there were things in the world that defied easy explanation. That mystery was a fact to be acknowledged rather than necessarily an issue to be addressed. The seasons persisted in their unending cycle, each bringing with them unique modifications while upholding a basic pattern. Springtime blooms gave way to scorching summers, which in turn gave way to gorgeous fall foliage and quiet winters. Life continued to be both commonplace and spectacular throughout it all. The tale that started out suspicious and afraid concluded with mutual respect and understanding. There was no dramatic conclusion or startling discovery that clarified everything. Only a slow realization that human societies were more intricate than they appeared. That depth might be found in unexpected places. When Thomas Garrett finally departed, a younger successor took up his duties. He told what he thought was proper about the keepers, hoping that the next generation of leaders would follow his example of deference. It was a covert, yet important legacy. Over the course of her long life, Margaret came to be known as the informal historian of the area. Her painstaking notes turned into a useful tool for anyone curious about South Carolina's actual history outside of the official accounts. She had turned curiosity into a contribution that will last. The river kept flowing. The woods were still thick, and beneath it all, those who wished to preserve the old customs were still doing so. It was a cycle that would probably persist for following generations, changing but never entirely going extinct. Consequently, the first alarming story turned out to be something else. Not about peril or threat, but about people searching for purpose in a large and frequently confusing world. About using methods that went beyond logical justification to establish ties with the past, present, and future. The forest's shadows weren't monsters. Rather, they were people upholding long-standing customs. The sounds of the night were echoes of ancient ceremonies, not ominous signs. The uncertainty persisted, but it became less frightening and more akin to adoration. And maybe that's what many of the mysteries we come upon really are. Complexities should be respected, not threats should be removed. Realities necessitate humility and an open mind, not issues that demand answers. For more stories like this, if you've read this far, think about becoming a subscriber to the channel. Post a comment with your opinions about this story, and remember to give the video a like. Every bit of assistance makes it possible for you to access more information like this. We appreciate your participation in this adventure. Until the next occasion.